Welcome to This Week on History Chat. Our speakers are Elia Shipton and Heather Hind. Their topic is Bodies in the Archive.
Well, hello and welcome. I'm Eleanor Shipton.
And I'm Heather Hind.
And we are both third year SWWDTP students. We both work in English literature.
And we are both Victorianists.
And we're here today to talk to you about our work in the archives, how archival research is important to our wider research and our topics, and general things about what we find interesting and what are the pitfalls and do we have any advice. So to start off, maybe it'd be useful for us to talk about our research and what we do. So Heather, do you want to start off?
Yeah, so my PhD research is on hair work in Victorian literature and culture. Hair work was the craft of making objects out of human hair, and I'm tracing its history through the 19th century while trying to place that history against literary representations of it, and kind of writings about hair work in craft manuals, newspapers, periodicals, adverts for hair work, trade cards for hair work, all of this kind of historical ephemera. Elia, what's your research project?
So I'm looking at postal bodies in 19th century literature. So I'm sort of starting from the point that communication and travel networks became sort of implicated within each other in the 19th century, sort of following from the legacy of the 18th century mail coach and the mail train and steam packet literally posted people as they travelled quickly and efficiently across Britain and the world. So my thesis asks how are literary authors using the mail in order to think about, articulate and theorise mobility or mobile subjectivities. And I'm looking at popular authors, particularly Charles Dickens, Wilkie Collins, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, to name a few. But I'm also really interested in periodical literature and newspaper articles. So that's one place in which my research sort of uses archives, but another way is sort of placing all of this in context with what was actually taking place within the postal network during the time, what changes are happening and how are these reflected or challenged in literature. So
we have quite a lot of crossover in terms of our approach to our topics. I didn't mention any of the authors that I'm studying. I'm mainly focusing on the Brontes, the Brownings, Wilkie Collins, so we have some crossover there, and Margaret Oliphant, and we both have to spend a bit of time in the archives to gather not disparate sources, but kind of all kinds of texts and material objects that we're looking at in order to chart the kinds of history that are cultural and kind of all over the place, manifest themselves in very different ways. Mm-hmm. I was going to ask why. Why is historical context important to your project?
This is a tricky one because I feel like I've worked in a sort of new historicist way for as long as I've been researching in literature. So even from my undergrad dissertation was very rooted in historical contexts and sort of placing them literature within these contexts. So I think for me it's important because I think that once you understand the historical context, what else is happening in the time, what that people are talking about, it can really shine light on what literature is doing. So for me, how is the mail train or the mail packet used as a metaphor for wider concerns about communication technology and the sort of anxieties and pleasures associated with these?
Mm-hmm. I'd say for me, hair work is a rather niche topic, and one which just purely in historical terms has only really been dealt with comprehensively in its American context. Mm-hmm. So there is one big study that came out a few years ago, Love Entwined, A History of Hair Work in America by Helen Shoemaker. And it's very good, but it doesn't do justice to the British context of hair work, which had its own specific trajectory. And I think with both of our projects, we're trying to show how very specific historical moments were represented in literature, but kind of what the relationship was between then how it was being represented and talked about and used as a metaphor and what was happening at that particular moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So what archives have you been using?
Okay, so as I say, my project is about a particular craft and a relatively niche craft at that. So there's unfortunately not one British hair work museum or archive that I can go to get all of my stuff. There is a hair museum in America in Independence, Missouri, I want to say, Layla's Hair Museum. I've really unfortunately not been there. But in terms of British archives or archives with British sources, I kind of have to go all over the place. So to name a few, I've been to the Manchester Gallery of Costume, the Harrogate Museums, the Bronte Parsonage Museum, the Armstrong Browning Library and the Harry Ransom, both in Texas, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the British Library, and I've had a few bits and pieces sent to me from Bristol Museums, from Bath. And I've seen little bits of hair work just kind of in display cabinets in places like Beamish in Yorkshire, and random museums I go to, and Exeter's own Royal Albert Memorial Museum. So very scattered. Elia, which archives have you been to?
Well, unlike you, my sort of archival research has been very contained. So the Postal Museum archive has been the most important to me. Interestingly, I've seen it in sort of 2 iterations in its previous location in Phoenix Square, and it's just moved about a year ago to the new Postal Museum, which is really a wonderful museum actually, and it's won a bunch of awards as well. So I've sort of seen it in both these places, which has been very interesting to sort of see how the relationship with the archive has changed once it's in this new space, and what decisions the archivists have made as well. And I've also used the British Library, but I also use a lot of online databases for newspapers and periodicals, and British Library newspapers online particularly, which is sort of in itself a sort of archival research in a very different way.
I'm going to pose the question, what is an archive?
Yes.
But we both we both experience that we gain an awful lot from looking at online archival databases, sources, things that have been digitised, especially because they're searchable. We'll get onto the kind of the ins and outs of actually doing archival research and how we go about it, but it's so useful, particularly because we've got particular terms that we are looking for. I'm looking for hair work, hair device, hair worker, artist in hair, all of these things. It's so much easier to find a newspaper or a periodical or even, a novel that's talking about these things in an online archive, something that's so searchable, so easy and so instant as well.
And to go through that kind of information as well and be able to pull out how it figures in newspapers and periodicals. It's just finding those key terms, so that sometimes requires a bit of work as well.
I sometimes feel like we might miss things in our approach to online research, because there are so many different ways that people write about the same thing, so many different ways it's phrased, that there is also something to be said for just pouring through material sources where you are forced to read everything. It's something a computer just can't do for you.
Yeah. Okay, shall we move on to our sort of questions? So we thought we'd keep this reasonably light, although there are a lot of theories about working in archives, but I'm not particularly familiar with them. So this is really based on personal experience. But yeah, well, I thought we'd start with what are the most exciting things we found in archives, because working in archives can be a bit of a chore. So when you find something exciting, it is really exciting. So I don't know whether you want to start us off, Heather.
Okay, I have 2. If we're thinking about online archives, possibly my most exciting find was, I think it was through Gale newspapers. And I was searching through, I'd searched hair work, hair worker, all of these terms. And most of the search results were for hair work adverts, things saying, come and buy our new, beautiful hair bracelets, the standard that I go through. One of the results that came up was shocking murder in Edinburgh by the Sterling Observer, and I thought, no, this is anomalous. This is not going to be about hair work. There's no way. But I opened it anyway and read through, and I've got a little blurb about it here. I just wanted to tell this story because it was so exciting. So in January 1863, the Sterling Observer reported a shocking murder in Edinburgh. James Patterson, a casual basis employee or outworker of Alexander Milne, artist in hair, was fatally stabbed by Milne with a dagger, which the Times later reported he had bought only that morning. It seems that Milne had taken to drinking heavily and had paranoid delusions that Patterson was planning to steal his wares, murder him and his family, and take over the successful hairwork business. Unfortunately, despite a plea of insanity, Milne was found guilty and later hanged. And this was obviously an exciting find. I'd found not only in the kind of the way that this was reported, discussion of how well this hairwork business was doing, so much so that Milne had to outsource some of the work to local craftsmen and kind of invite them in and pay them on a casual basis because he just was having so many orders. But also evidence that this was really profitable. It was kind of driving this person's delusions that he'd taken to alcoholism. Like this, you know, might have been a personal thing, but you've got to think, what were the pressures and the anxieties and all of the dangers, I guess, around hairwork at this time as a business that it kind of came to this. Also, reading the articles in more details, there was a nice detail that said Milne had hosted a Christmas party a month before the murder where he drew a sword and performed numerous vagaries with it, frightening his guests. So he'd been a bit unstable for a while. It was just unfortunate that this was then put to one of his workers. What's your most exciting find?
It's funny because actually you talking about that has made me think about the exciting finds online. And one of a recent discovery was the prevalence of not only madmen on the railway, which has been established by academics such as Amy Milne Smith, but particularly that in many of these newspaper articles, madmen were on the mail train, either on the mail express train or the night mail. And it wonderfully encapsulates all the anxieties around technology, the body, and speed. So the mail train was by far the quickest route or the quickest way to travel by train. Most passenger trains sort of ran between 20 and 30 miles per hour, whereas the mail train, even as early as sort of 1850, was running at 45 to 50 miles an hour, and they didn't stop. So once you were on the train, the next stop might be an hour and a half away. So if you're stuck in your compartment with a madman, you're all encapsulated in this anxiety of being trapped in a space with someone whose body cannot handle the speed of the mail. And there's this wonderful article. I should caveat that I don't think many of these were strictly true. It was sort of a hysteria or newspaper panic. But there's one article in which a madman on the mail train, so there are two gentlemen sat in second class, and they think they're the only people on the carriage. But then as the train speeds up, they realise there's a man outside sort of jumping between the steps of the carriages, and he laughs maniacally at them through the window. And as they come into stations to stop, and they go outside and say, "There's a madman on the railway," when they go to see him, he's sort of sat very sedately and gentlemanlike in first class, and he's fine. So he's sort of left on board because he can perform the sane man. But as the train speeds up once again, he's sort of leaping like a cat around the carriages of the mail train. So it was a really, I guess, kind of macabre, but also really fun example of the kind of anxieties and tensions around speedy communication and travel, and very much taking place upon the body. But yeah, my original answer to that question was going to be finding the work of Trollope, Anthony Trollope, who is an important author for me, mainly because he worked for the post office for many years, about 30 years, at the same time that he was writing prolifically, and finding his work as a surveyor, sort of mapping the network of the post in rural areas and trying to make it more efficient, really helped me to understand how his work is as an author is sort of caught up with this work of efficiency within the post office. So yes, a very rambling response to that.
No, that's good. I like different examples. I had a second example. I was going to pick up after you'd said the body.
Oh, sorry.
I can pick up as well after you're talking, about post. I have an example that's to do with the body and envelopes. So when I was doing some research in the Harry Ransom Centre, it was the kind of research where it's such a big institution. They have so much hair work as well as locks of hair, all kinds of hair jewellery. I saw some amazing rings woven out of hair. They had hair that's kind of plaited and trapped in lockets, hair necklaces, all of these, amazing things made out of hair. But the thing that was really interesting and a bit special was unworked hair. So I was going through the collections of the Coleridge family, as in Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the Romantic poet, and it had his whole family's kind of collection in hair, basically there, all in envelopes. They'd collected it over years as kind of mementos. But as I was going through this, I'm obviously talking about head hair, right? People used to, clip a lock of hair from your child, from your mother, from your brother, from your fiancé, and keep it as, a loving memento. There was also a practice of doing this on someone's deathbed. It wasn't as popular as people seem to think it was. The Victorians did have a very large and prominent mourning culture, but not all hair work is about remembering the dead or about mourning or is macabre or is doing something in that capacity. A lot of the time it was just about love and affection and other things. But this one example was from Sarah Coleridge, and she had collected her husband's hair on his deathbed and put it into an envelope, but the envelope read, "My beloved's hair from around his left nipple." So this was a woman who decided, I want to remember my loved one. I'm not just going to go and clip a lock of the hair from his head. I'm going to take his chest hair, stuff it in an envelope and keep it forevermore until Heather finds it 200 years later. I tweeted it and it was actually my most popular tweet ever. People go mad for chest hair, it seems. That was a good day.
Oh, that's excellent. So I guess that might also be like a weird or unexpected find. I knew that my weird find wouldn't come up to yours, but the post can be a little dry. But one of my favourite discoveries, and I think it'll probably end up being a footnote, which is a shame, but was researching Sir Rowland Hill at the Postal Museum archive. Sir Rowland Hill basically engineered the uniform penny post of 1840, which was the moment in which the post office really took off as a democratic network for anyone and everyone. So it meant that you could send a letter anywhere in the country for a penny. And yes, he was later made Sir. But as I was looking through his documents, and especially as he was made, I think, Postmaster General or a similarly titled higher level management of the post office, he had an annotated copy of Charles Babbage's passages from A Life of a Philosopher, because in this text, Babbage had basically said, myself and General Colby thought up the uniform penny post. And so in this copy, Hill underlines several sections and sort of writes a response at the end where he concludes that Babbage wasn't quite saying that he sort of engineered the penny post. That was definitely me, Sir Rowland Hill. And it was sort of this wonderful moment of this figure that is sort of held in such high esteem. You could see his almost that imposter syndrome of it wasn't Babbage, it was me, which was wonderful and very human, and I think definitely showed how close uniform penny post was to his heart as well. So yeah, that would probably be my most unexpected find, or even as well most candid find within a very sort of administrative archive.
We're going to talk next on the other side of finds, our most disappointing find. I've got one which was an actual find and another which was just a non-starter. My non-starter find was going again to the Harry Ransom and requesting all of their hair, basically. They very usefully have a document which lists all of the human hair in their archives, and on this list they said they had Marie Antoinette's hair in a locket. I was very excited. I was so excited that 2 nights before I sat and watched the Kirsten Dunst film. And unfortunately, on the day I got there, requested it, and it was out for conservation work with the entire collection of Marie Antoinette's things. And I tried not to look too disappointed when the curator told me this, but I'm sad.
Yeah.
I think they've got some in the British British Museum.
Ooh.
I think there is some in the UK. I guess a lot of hair was collected from Marie Antoinette. A popular person for hair.
Yes, and beauty and
all of these things. My most disappointing actual find was probably in the National Archives. I found that they had a load of trade catalogues from the 19th century where people would basically put their patents. So if you designed something new, you'd invented something, you'd kind of have it physically in that trade catalogue. And there was a record for someone who had patented a particular hair bracelet. This was also one of the first times I'd been to an archive because I'd gone to the National Archives training day. So I had high hopes. I had really high hopes that this was going to be my first really great bit of archival research. And they brought the book out and it was absolutely massive. I know you can't see me gesturing, but it was as big as the table in front of me. I'm not good with dimensions, but just trust me, it was really huge and heavy, and I had to put it on a wheelie table in order to get it over to a desk. And it was so thick. I opened it, eventually managed to find the hair worker's patent, and it was a measly little pencil drawing of some loops. You couldn't even tell it was hair. It was just a little drawing of a little loopy design that he'd gone to the trouble of patenting. I was so disappointed and just had to wheel this huge book back.
Oh, that's the worst.
Yeah.
Actually, my most disappointing find was probably similar to yours in a sense, but almost had the opposite problem. So the reason that the mail train didn't have to stop, it could carry on and miss out loads of stops, was because in 1840s, the General Post Office invented mailbag apparatus, which they never renamed, which is a shame. But this was basically this mechanism that stood at the side of railway, and as the mail train went past, the mail carriage would pull out this net, and the contraption meant that the mail train could chuck out a bag and the net would catch a bag hanging on the side. So this exchange happened whilst the train was travelling at 45 to 50 miles an hour. And the periodical literature on the mail train obsessed over this apparatus. They talk about it so much, and it's this really sort of violent act. So I really wanted to sort of understand how it worked. And there weren't that many items on it at the archive, but one of them was plans for this apparatus from the late 19th century. And it was sort of this problem where however much you study a catalogue, you never quite know what's going to turn up. And these plans were on these enormous rolls that we had to sort of take up several tables, and the archivist had to help me get them out. And they were so detailed and, you know, very much from an engineering perspective that I could take away very little from them. Each sort of layer had a different element and it never really came together. So I never got a sense of how it actually worked because the plans were far too detailed for my non-engineering background. So I had to sort of pretend that it was really useful, and I was really happy that she rolled them all out for me. But yeah, so that was sort of the opposite. Working in archive has the potential to really help and guide you, or to feel like you're just coming up against dead ends. Mm-hmm. Particularly when you feel like something should exist but you can't find it. Like, I'm sure there must be medical records for the men who worked on the mail train, mm-hmm. but I cannot find them.
I feel the same way about hair work. It was a relatively middle class thing, I guess, to do in Victorian Britain, but I don't think it can be have been exclusively for wealthy people, because although I have hair work craft manuals that tell me, you know, how many pounds and shillings a hair necklace would cost to commission, newspaper guides for making these things at home, as well as just people in the family passing on the skills with which to make things out of hair, alongside things like jewellery casings, the gold standard dropping in the mid-1850s, imitation materials becoming more widely available towards the end of the 19th century, all meant that people that didn't have generous incomes would, of course, have been able to make things out of hair. And it's a free material. You know, you've got your hair, you can make something with it, if it's putting it in a locket, or it's plaiting it, or it's making a bracelet, or it's just doing something with it. But these are the things that you don't find in museums, because they either were a family whose collections haven't been preserved, or the casings aren't gold and turquoises and things that have been kept for their more stable value. Or perhaps they were more ephemeral, delicate objects that also just haven't been kept because, again, they weren't kept within these particular conditions in these casings. Or if they were kept in gold lockets, maybe they had to be pawned because this family can't afford to just keep great-great-great-grandma's locket forever. So I do think when you're doing archival research, you do have to not read between the lines or kind of over-speculate, but acknowledge that there are going to be things that you will not find for various reasons as you go through.
Absolutely. So I guess sort of following on from that, what are the sort of challenges of working in an archive? I guess we've touched on it in the sense that you never really know what you're going to find, and sometimes there's nothing there at all. But maybe, the practical challenges of working in an archive.
So for me, because what I look at isn't just textual material, which has its own challenges, I'm sure you can elaborate on this, but because I'm looking at material objects and things that are relatively fragile, And also because I'm in literature, and although we get offered training opportunities, and you know, a lot of archives will give you an induction, there are curators who can help you. There's often, at least on kind of museum and archive websites, a kind of guide to using their collections, like physically using their collections. It can be really difficult just to know how to handle objects, especially ones, as I say, that are a bit fragile or a bit awkward. Or so my anecdote for this is, I'm not going to name what museum it was, but I was in a particular archive looking at a collection of a family's hair work, and one of the objects that came out was a little brown pillbox, so just a kind of tiny little box, and it was kind of translucent. You could kind of see that there was hair in it, and inside the kind of circle of hair there was a label, and because there was a label inside this little box, I assumed that you just open the box. I don't know what object this is without finding its catalogue number, so I started opening this little pillbox, which didn't have a kind of clasp or anything. It was kind of just jammed shut. I started opening it, and as soon as I did, hair just started unfurling and kind of pouring out of this tiny box. I will say I managed to tuck it back inside. I did not damage the hair. I didn't lose any. I didn't carry any away with me. But for a moment, I was like, oh, goodness, the curator behind me is going to see me just like pushing this hair back inside a little pillbox. And I was so scared when it started happening that I didn't even see what the catalogue number was. So I don't even know whose hair it was or what it was for, just that it was inside this very awkward archival packaging.
It's a wonderful moment of the object sort of behaving in a way that is really troublesome, and I think that's really helpful for thinking about it in literature as well. For me, a lot of the archival items that I'm looking at are sort of 19th century administration items that sort of detail when trains ran, memos between different men in the post office, sort of asking about schedules and the penny post and sort of infrastructural things. But because they're memos, they're often on very, very fine blue paper that I'm sure has a real name, but I don't know what it is.
Like tracing paper, or
not quite that
transfer
thin.
Paper, or
I don't know, maybe it's like just memo kind of working paper, but it is incredibly fine. And I think partly due to the conditions that they've maybe been kept in before they've been put in this wonderful storage facility, they can sort of crumble around you. And it is one of the moments where I'm thankful that I do have like a bit of training on how to handle very delicate objects, because you can just feel like I can't touch this because it's too delicate. I actually had one where they were talking about there were memos going back and forth about what to charge newspapers for travelling on mail trains, and one of the clerks had sent a sort of envelope with a supplement in it from the London Illustrated News, and I sort of started to open it and get it out, and it was this sort of probably A4 print of maybe the Great Exhibition or one of these big events that the Victorians sort of loved to illustrate. And as I started to get it out, it was quite clear that it was just going to fall apart if I went so almost like your hair, that it just started sort of spilling out, and it was like, no, this all has to go back in, and it did, and it was fine. But yeah, sometimes archival items can be quite troubling, and they kind of misbehave on you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to think, what advice then would you give to a student who might be doing archival research for the first time, or not quite sure how to go about it, or, you know, integrate it in their research?
Oh, that's a big question.
Sorry, that was like 3 questions instead of 1.
I guess I'd start with email the archivist, get to know the archivist, because they can be super, super helpful. I had I needed maps of the circulation networks of the post office, and they've got some beautiful 19th century circulation maps in the Postal Museum, but there weren't enough people upstairs to allow someone to go downstairs to bring up these enormous maps, because they needed 2 people. So in the end, they let me go down into storage with them, and they got out a map and I sort of photographed it quickly, so they didn't have to take it all the way upstairs. So that was a sort of a wonderful example of how helpful archivists can be, and that they are passionate about their collections, and they do want you to use them. In terms of how, actually, I'll let you sort of bounce off that question, and then maybe we can talk about how to integrate it into your research.
Sure. So I'd say absolutely ask before you go to an archive. Number one, don't, as we've said, sometimes you might not find what you're looking for. Don't just assume something is going to be there, or assume that it's not going to be a way for conservation work, or somehow inaccessible. A few of the things I've requested at the National Archives have been such that they've gone to get the thing out for me and then found, it's too mouldy. We've actually realised, since you've requested it, that we need to take this away for a bit of work. But always email ahead, not only because it's polite, or you might have to book a reading room, or there might be other practical things, but because the curators often know what's not in the catalogue, or know ways of searching the catalogue that you don't, because the way that catalogue systems work can be so different. And they can also just be so helpful and willing to kind of help you get everything that you might need. So last year I went to the Manchester Gallery of Costume because I emailed them, because they were closed, and they've been closed to the public for a couple of years because they're doing really extensive conservation on their entire collection. But I thought, I know it's closed, but I might as well email them just to see. And they were entirely happy for me to go in and give me free reign of their research collections. It was amazing. They had a whole 2 drawers full of hair work. That's the only place I've ever been where the hair work and the bits of hair haven't been scattered all over different collections. It's actually all been in one drawer. So that was mightily convenient and exciting. What further advice do you have?
I guess, well, on a practical level, make a spreadsheet. Be really clear when you're writing up what you're finding, what the catalogue number is, where you found it, and keep extensive records, because it's really easy to get caught up in the interest of the research and forget that stuff. But if you ever try and find, once you leave the archive, you can never find that again. So you have to be really clear in your writing up where this has actually come from, because you will forget.
I'd add, check the kind of photograph policy of the place that you're doing your research in, but most places are happy for you to take non-flash photography, at least for your own personal records. Take a few angles, take a few pictures. Sometimes you don't realise it's blurry until you're miles away from the archive and wish you'd just spent the time to take a few photos of each thing. That can be really useful. I find especially if I'm wading through text. If I'm in an archive just for one day, it's much better me making sure I've got a record of that set of letters or that chapter of a book or whatever it is, than just trying to furiously write notes all day.
Yeah, I totally agree. And on the note of reading, I think Victorians in particular are quite hard to read. They're I think this is a boom in education and literacy, so you have many more types of people writing. And it can be a nightmare trying to decipher letters or memos for me, but stick with it. Read it once, take what you can from it, read some more others and come back to it, because even in a day you can get used to that kind of writing very quickly.
Oh, my other bit of advice on the note of if you're going to an archive is if you're legally allowed by the archive to share things that you found in there, kind of photographs and whatever, share it. If you've got Twitter, or I don't know what other platforms would you do it on, if you blog, if you have any, or just talking to your fellow PhD friends and your supervisors. If you find something exciting in an archive, don't just keep it to yourself. Tweet about it or share it somehow, because again with the chest hair thing, going back to that, I tweeted it because it was weird, expecting a few other people would find it weird. I actually got loads of responses that were like, did you know that Allen Ginsberg clipped the pubes off a load of other Beat Generation poets and kept them in where was it now? Is it the one in Indiana? Lilly Library? But loads of people tweeted me saying, I've also found chest hair in this location. It's really useful once you start sharing things that other people have knowledge to. Other people may have been to the same archives or other ones and found similar things or things that don't match up, and that can be a really useful tool as well, I think.
Absolutely. And I guess my sort of final piece of advice would be in regards to the imposter syndrome. I think even as a third year, I can walk into an archive and feel like, oh, do I belong here? I do. That's what my research entails, so I need to be there. And I think sort of being firm with yourself and confident in your research. I was quite confident undergrad, and for my undergrad dissertation I actually did work in the Wellcome library archives. I mean, a very small amount compared to what I do now, but it was a real insight into how an archive works. But this is, you know, a massively swish building in London, Euston, and, you know, and it's so silent in the library, and I really felt like, oh, I'm the youngest person here by a while, and am I meant to be here? And I was, and they treated me really well, and they were interested in my research. So even at that level, you're meant to be there. So I think that does come with not knowing what you're going to find. Is it going to help your research questions? Is it going to hinder them? But yeah, we belong in archives, so it's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I've got two final notes, and the first one that leads me on to another side note is we'd both like to thank the SWWDTP for funding this research.
Yeah.
If you are listening to this as a DTP student and there's an archive you want to go to, put in for the funding to do it, because again, you don't know what you're going to find or how integral to your research it's going to be, but it's always worth the trip to go and look.
Yeah.
And we've also both been generously funded by specific museum library fellowships. So Elia is going to the Huntington Library later in the year to do some research, and I was really generously funded by the Armstrong Browning Library in Waco, Texas. And it's the kind of thing where I thought, there's no way they're going to, you know, pay for me to fly over and look at bits of the Browning's hair. Like, why, you know, obviously I believe in my research and I know its value, but it can be really difficult to communicate that to others, I think.
Yeah.
But I think also the library fellowships are so useful because they give you the time to spend in that specific archive, and they want you to come, and they set you up with curators, and that becomes a really, I think, valuable experience too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Try and get to as many archives as you can, because you never know what you're going to find.
No. Is there anything you'd like, in the spirit of podcasts, is there anything, we've done our sponsorship, is there anything you'd like to plug? What's your Twitter handle?
Oh, I'm Elia Jane on Twitter, but I have just been thinking, as you've spoken about tweeting your research, that you're very good at that and I am very bad. So maybe I'll be better. If you follow me, I'll try and be better.
And I think I'm at Heather Lou Hind. I'm sure you can just try Googling us. Google like hair work Heather, and I'm pretty sure
You'll come up.
I'm at least top 3 in what comes up.
Excellent. So thank you very much for listening. We hope this has been interesting and maybe helpful. And yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
The producers of History Chat were Henry Marsh and Tabitha Stanmore. It was brought to you with the kind support of the South West and Wales Doctoral Training Partnership and the Digital Humanities Lab at the University of Exeter.